We're now in section number 2. Section number 1 focused primarily on the Bill of Rights. Okay, right now, stay seated because we haven't started reading yet. Thank you. Stay seated. Section number 2 begins to look at the rest of the amendments and focuses on citizens or individual rights that are found in the rest of the amendments. Now, there's a great deal of concentration with regards to the right to vote. Why? Well, because the right to vote, when we were looking at it a couple of weeks ago, when we were looking at the International Declaration or the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the right to vote is considered to be a civil right. A civil right meaning a right that we receive because we're human beings. Now, the right to vote really is more than just casting a vote. The right to vote really means the right to participate in government. Now, originally, meaning at the beginning of the United States, if you were not a landowner, you weren't considered to have a stake in government. If you didn't have a stake in government, and stake I don't mean the type that you cook and eat. I mean an interest in government. You couldn't vote. And I'll give you a perfect example that I used with the other class. It had to do with Orly. Okay? Because Orly from time to time forgets to bring his permission slip. So when Orly forgets his permission slip and you all go on a field trip, Orly has to stay. And he stays with the 7th grade. But assume that the day that Orly stays with the 7th grade, there is a vote on the 7th grade t-shirt. We vote on the 7th grade t-shirt. Now, should Orly participate in that vote?
Yes.
No. Why not?
Sucks for him.
Orly doesn't have a stake in the vote, doesn't have an interest in the vote. And therefore, Orly's not going to vote, even though he's in a class. Well, originally, when you lived in a state and you didn't own land, they believed that you didn't have an interest in the state because you could move from New York to Pennsylvania, and if you moved from New York to Pennsylvania, you didn't have a stake in New York. But if you own land, you can't take your land from New York to Pennsylvania because land can't be moved. Therefore, the people that owned land, like the 7th graders, had a stake in the election. The people that did not have a stake in the election. So originally, voting was based on land ownership in the United States. But what happens? Time begins to pass. And in the United States, I know that you all know that time is divided, okay, AD and BC, correct? It's divided in half. Before and after the death of Christ, right? If you were thinking of the United States, time is also divided in half. The first half is before the Civil War. The second half is after the Civil War. The Civil War marked a very bright line in the history of the United States. And let me tell you why. Before the Civil War, if you lived in a state, it was like living in a country. When people asked you where you were from, you didn't say, I'm American. You said, I'm Virginian, I'm Georgian, I'm a New Yorker. Because what was important was the state. So that's why if you didn't own land in that state, you were kind of questioned that you could leave to another state. Your allegiance to that state was in question. Because what was important was the state. But then came the Civil War. And the Civil War changed a lot of things. But one of the things that changed is that it changed the importance of the state after the Civil War. After the Civil War was fought. What was important was no longer the state. Now, we weren't just citizens of Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and North Carolina and South Carolina. We were now Americans first. What was important was the national government. And since what was important was the national government, if you moved from Georgia to Alabama or to Tennessee, it didn't matter because you still had a stake in the United States. You still had an interest in the United States, and therefore, even if you didn't own land, and by the way, moving from the United States to another country was very difficult. If you lived in Georgia, you'd have to travel a long distance to go to Mexico or to go to California or to go to Europe. So generally you didn't have much choice but to stay a citizen of the United States, even if you wanted to move. Okay? The majority of people didn't have that choice. But as a consequence, you had a stake in the history and the future of the United States. And the belief about having a vote changed. So who has a vote? Well, of course, people that have a vote don't necessarily now have to own land. They have to just be white men. Women don't have a stake yet. Because it was believed that a woman was really the product of their father. And they didn't leave their home until they were married. Now they were the product of their husbands. And if their husband died but they had a male child, they were now the product of their sons. Okay? And don't complain about this because this is historical. As a matter of fact, it's so historical that one of the most famous references in biblical history has to do with this. When Christ from the cross says to John, "This is your mother," talking about Mary. What Christ is doing on a legal basis is he's giving Mary someone to be attached to. Because otherwise she would not have any male. Joseph presumably is dead. Her son, Jesus, is dead. A woman without an attachment to a male didn't have any legal rights. So even though that had changed a little, it hadn't changed a great deal even after the Civil War. But let's leave women's suffrage, the word that we use is suffrage. Let's leave women's suffrage for later. The first suffrage that we're talking about is African Americans. Now, before we can truly and completely talk about African Americans, we're going to talk about 3 amendments, Ricky. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment, if you really want to know, a really good job was done by the movie Abraham Lincoln. Steven Spielberg, which is, I think, my favorite director. Steven Spielberg, considered one of the best directors in Hollywood, made the movie about Abraham Lincoln. And in that movie, it's really a history of the 13th Amendment. Okay, I'm not talking about Lincoln Vampire Killer. That's a different movie. Okay? But let me tell you what happened. And by the way, Spielberg doesn't portray Lincoln as the ideal president, as kind of like the bigger than human God. He sees Lincoln with all the good and the bad that human beings have. But he sees that Lincoln has an issue. Let me tell you what his issue is. Before the Civil War, there had been the Dred Scott case that we talked about. And that was that slave that said, "My master took me to a free state, I should be free." And the Supreme Court of the United States said, "You are property, you don't have the right to be here, get out of here." Well, Lincoln's problem was that that Supreme Court that said that was the Supreme Court that existed during the Civil War. They weren't a Supreme Court of the South. They were the same Supreme Court. And Lincoln felt that whatever he did with slavery, if he set them free, the Supreme Court could say, "Mr. President, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that." So in order to avoid the Supreme Court saying you can't do that, Lincoln has to persuade a change in the Constitution. he has to persuade a change in the Constitution that makes African Americans free. And that's the passage of the 13th Amendment, and it wasn't easy because there were people in the North that even though they didn't believe in slavery, weren't willing to do that. So he had to persuade a lot of people. And remember, in the North, it's not just the North, it's the border states, and the border states accepted slavery. They had slaves. So the movie Lincoln, which is a really good history of the 13th Amendment, shows the interaction that Lincoln did. But you see, freedom by itself doesn't get you anywhere. Saying you're free doesn't make you a participant in society. You can't participate in government. Think about it. You all here in this classroom, to a certain extent, are free. You don't go home. You're not in a jail. They don't beat you every night, every other night maybe. You have chores, but seldom do you do them. You leave your underwear in the living room and so on. You get to hear your mother yell and then pick them up and put them away. So you have a certain degree of freedom. But guess what? You're not fully functional members of your home society or society. You can't vote. You can't participate in government. So freedom by itself doesn't get you anywhere. So the 14th Amendment steps up and says, not only are you free, if you are born in the United States, listen to me with your eyeballs, not with your pink markers. So you need to be free. You need to have a relationship with the United States. And a relationship with the United States is being a citizen. So the 13th Amendment freed slaves. The 14th Amendment, one of the things that it does, apart from due process that we've already talked about, is it provides all people born in the United States with citizenship. It basically says if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. Ricky and Ryan, whatever it is that you're doing, put it away, turn it off. Put the iPads on top of the desk and close them. Thank you. Appreciate it. Ricky, where's yours? Okay, great. So, the 14th Amendment provides all citizens except for Native Americans citizenship if you're born in the United States. Eddie, why are Native Americans, do you think, excluded from receiving citizenship?
Because we took their property.
So we take their land and then we say, you're not a citizen of this land, it was yours.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds a little bit unfair.
It does, but we're unfair.
And kind of like harsh. Ricky's got his hand's about to fall off his arm if I don't call him Ricky. Because they're a different race and therefore we discriminate. We're giving African Americans the right to right of citizenship and we're not giving it to Native Americans. It doesn't make any sense because Native Americans and African Americans are different races. If race does exist, and I'm not sure it does. So why are Native Americans being treated so harshly? Because America's bad? No, I don't think so. Yes, right.
Because they don't like us.
Because they don't like us, and therefore we're not making you a citizen. Yes. Okay, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. Cecilia, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't call on me. I don't know. I'm just looking good to you. Okay. Yes.
Do they have to do anything that we send them out on like a trail? That they have like
okay. It doesn't have to do with we send them out on a trail, but we're going to come back here to Ms. Zambrano. Stop. Ms. Zambrano, could you please tell us what you mean? The natives did not receive citizenship because they were already citizens of their own government. The Cherokee had its own government. Now, you're probably thinking, as I was when I was sitting in your chair, how can you have a government, a country within a country? Well, the Vatican is a country within Italy, and it's a separate country. So, There are examples around the world of a country within a